The crackling sound of the BBQ was almost foreign to the women standing behind the wire. For months, they had been taught that the enemy was merciless, that captivity would mean endless suffering, and that no kindness would be shown. Now, on a Texas ranch, the American cowboys were preparing a feast. The sweet, savory aroma of grilling meat danced through the air. Something the women hadn't tasted in so long they could barely remember what it was. They stood frozen, wary, as the cowboys laughed and spoke in a tongue they barely understood. Then, something unexpected happened. The women moved forward, and in one coordinated gesture, they knelt before the barbecue. They weren't hungry, they weren't broken, they were offering something, something that shocked the cowboys beyond measure. They bowed. Not out of fear, but out of respect. It was an act that defied everything they had been told about the enemy. They weren't just prisoners. They were still, somehow, dignified. The scent of sizzling meat wafted over them, cutting through the dusty air like a knife, and for the first time in months, the Japanese women in captivity were confronted with something beyond the horror of war. The smell was rich, fatty, and almost intoxicating. It clung to the dry wind, mingling with the earthy scent of the ranch and the sharp, crisp scent of charred wood. It was the smell of comfort, of warmth, of something they had long forgotten. The sound of the meat crackling over the open flame was a strange music, almost a lullaby. The rhythmic sizzle echoed in the air, louder than any gunshot or command. To the women, it was both an invitation and a curse. They hadn't tasted anything like it in so long. Their stomachs tightened, aching from hunger, yet their minds screamed in resistance. Could this truly be happening? The world they had known was one of starvation and deprivation. They had been fed promises of cruelty from their captors, promises of degradation that would break them, make them submit, make them feel less than human. This was something else entirely. As they stood in line, the air grew heavier, the tension palpable. Their bodies, thin and worn, could hardly contain the wave of hunger that rolled through them, but their minds, ever loyal to the ideology of Bushido, warned them to resist. The image of surrender as disgrace flashed through their minds. This wasn't just a meal. It was an act of defiance to everything they had been taught. To take the food would be to betray their honor, to accept a kindness from their enemies, an enemy they had been taught to fear and loathe. The battle inside them intensified. Some of the women shifted uneasily on their feet, glancing at the American soldiers tending the fire. They watched with suspicious eyes as the men flipped the meat with ease, chatting amongst themselves. The soldiers, oblivious to the storm of emotion brewing within the women, seemed calm, detached. They were simply doing their job, feeding the prisoners. There was no fanfare, no pomp, just men, casually preparing food. No violence, no scorn, just routine. The women shuffled closer, their eyes drawn to the golden brown pieces of meat sizzling on the grill, to the soft, warm bread being passed around. Their mouths watered, but their hands remained rigid at their sides, as if the very act of reaching out for it would break something inside them. The first woman in line took a step forward, her hand trembling, not from fear of the enemy, but from the crushing weight of history and culture bearing down on her. She hesitated, then reached for a piece of bread. Her fingers grazed the warm crust, the texture soft, a stark contrast to the brittle, rationed bread they had been given in Japan. Her eyes darted up to the American soldier handing it to her. He was smiling, but not in mockery. His expression was neutral, almost kind, and there it was again, the dissonance. She had been taught that kindness from the enemy was a lie, a trick to lure them into submission. But here it was, so raw and undeniable. No cruelty, no humiliation, just a soldier offering her food. Just food. Her breath caught in her throat as she held the bread. She could feel the warmth radiating from it. And for the first time in what felt like forever, a part of her wanted to believe this wasn't a trap. She wanted to believe that this was real. But there was still a part of her that resisted. There was still a part of her that could not shed the years of indoctrination, the years of teaching that surrender was dishonor. And yet, as the bread passed from the American soldier's hand into hers, she felt something shift. It wasn't just the bread that passed between them. It was an exchange of something more profound, more human. In that moment, they weren't captor and captive. They were simply two people sharing a moment, one that had been shaped by the cruel hands of war but was now marked by the strange tenderness of survival. The other women watched in silence, their faces etched with disbelief. Slowly, hesitantly, they followed her lead. One by one, their hands reached out. They accepted the food not with the hesitation of prisoners, but with the quiet, tentative curiosity of people unsure of the world they now found themselves in. They ate not as victims, but as women. Women who had been stripped of everything except their hunger. And now, with each bite, they began to realize that their captors were not the monsters they had been told to expect. This meal, so simple, yet so powerful, marked the beginning of a shift they could not yet fully comprehend. The women's hesitation began to melt away, replaced with a quiet acceptance, a tentative understanding that maybe, just maybe, the enemy was not what they had been led to believe. And in that acceptance, something else was born, a bond, forged not by war, but by the shared need for survival. As the last of the bread reached their hands, the women of the POW group stood for a moment in stunned silence, their gazes fixed on the fire. The crackle of the flames was the only sound that pierced the heavy air. Then, in one fluid movement, the women, each in their own time, lowered their heads, not in defeat, but in reverence. The motion was slow, deliberate, and ancient. It was a bow, a gesture of respect. It wasn't the bow they had been taught to give to their emperor, nor was it one for the gods. It was a bow given to those who had done the unimaginable, shown them kindness. For a fleeting second, the entire camp seemed to hold its breath. The soldiers, standing with plates of food in their hands, froze. The women weren't begging for food or pleading for mercy. Instead, they were offering respect. In a moment that defied the men's expectations, the women stood in stillness, eyes to the ground, heads lowered. It was a profound silence that spoke more than words ever could. The American cowboys had been trained to see their captives through a lens of fear and prejudice. They had been told to expect a vicious enemy, hardened, unyielding, a threat. They had anticipated resistance, defiance, and perhaps even violence. They were ready to face fear, shame, and brokenness in their prisoners. Instead, they found dignity. At first, the cowboys looked at each other, eyes wide, unsure of what they were witnessing. One cowboy, his brow furrowed in confusion, glanced at another and muttered, Did they just bow?" There was no mocking, no ridicule, only the sharpest sense of disbelief. The bow wasn't an act of submission. It was an acknowledgement, a moment of shared humanity that caught the men completely off guard. It wasn't weakness. It wasn't surrender. It was simply the women showing that even in their most vulnerable moment, they could still command respect. They weren't the enemy they had been taught to despise. They were something else entirely. The air around the BBQ suddenly felt charged with an unfamiliar tension. The cowboys, who had expected to see women broken by hunger and fear, were now faced with something far more complex. Their preconceived notions about these women, who they were, why they had fought, and how they might react, began to unravel. This wasn't the cowardice they had imagined. This wasn't the submission they had anticipated. These women were proud, not of their circumstances, but of something deeper. Their honor wasn't based on power or strength, but on survival and resilience. The cowboys' expressions shifted from confusion to recognition. as though a veil had been lifted. They could see, in that bow, the essence of what these women had been through, the brutal history of war, the demands of loyalty and sacrifice, and the weight of their culture. They weren't enemies. They were simply women, complicated, vulnerable, and, in that moment, profoundly dignified. The men looked down at their plates of food and, for the first time since their arrival, felt a twinge of discomfort. They had been handed food to offer, but now they understood that what was happening wasn't just about hunger, it was about something far deeper, far more human. This quiet exchange, unspoken yet so loud, stirred something inside the cowboys. The clash of cultures that had initially been so stark began to fade, replaced by the realization that what they had been taught about honor, submission, and the enemy was not as clear-cut as they had once believed. The women had not succumbed to desperation. They had not begged. Instead, they had offered the one thing that even in the direst moments of war could not be taken: respect. It was a concept so deeply embedded in their culture that, even in captivity, it had not withered. And in that moment, the cowboys recognized the enormity of what they were witnessing. Their initial expectations were not just shattered, they were replaced by something else entirely: the recognition of shared humanity. This was a war not just between nations, but between ideas, between cultures. What the women had done was not just bowing, it was a statement that transcended their roles as prisoners or captors. It was the soundless proclamation that they were still human, still worthy of dignity. And that realization, however subtle, would echo far beyond the borders of this strange, unexpected battlefield. The women had bowed, and in doing so, they had taught the men something they hadn't known they needed to learn. But it wasn't always like this. Before the barbed wire, before the kind faces and warm food, there had been the cold, hard rules of survival in wartime Japan. The lessons had started when they were children taught to endure, to sacrifice, and to believe that survival meant suffering. They were taught that they were tools of war, warriors in a battle much larger than themselves, bound to the will of their emperor and the demands of the country. There was no place for weakness in this world, no space for fear or hesitation. Every day was a battle to prove your worth, your loyalty, your sacrifice. The ideals of Bushido, the warrior's code, drilled into them from an early age, defined not by courage in battle, but by an unflinching ability to endure suffering with no complaint. The war had ravaged Japan, and yet the teachings had only grown more intense. Suffering was not just a consequence of war, it was an honor. Pain was the price of devotion, and silence was the badge of loyalty. To live through the worst, to survive, was the ultimate test of character, and so they survived. But as the war wore on and the air grew heavier with the scent of death, the women began to understand the true weight of what they were expected to endure. The battles were no longer about honor on the field, but about survival in the face of complete destruction. Rations grew thinner, cities crumbled. Every morning felt like a countdown to something inevitable, something final. Still, they held on. They kept walking, kept fighting, kept sacrificing. They told themselves that surrender was never an option, that it would be worse than death. To surrender would bring dishonor, disgrace, a shame that would ripple through their families and the generations that followed. Their lives, their very essence, were tied to the emperor and to the concept of sacrifice. Surrender was an end, and then, one day, it wasn't. The moment of capture came with the loud crash of defeat. The war, which had once felt distant, an unstoppable force moving through their lives, had finally reached them. It was not a glorious death on the battlefield. It was not a dignified end, falling honorably in the name of the emperor. No, it was a shock, a complete break from everything they had been taught. The American soldiers did not storm in with the bloodthirsty aggression they had imagined. They came in quietly, methodically. The women were taken by surprise, confused by the strange calmness of it all. They had expected brutality, screaming, violence, cruelty, but what they received was simply the cold efficiency of captivity. The American soldiers did not mock them. They did not treat them as anything less than human. And yet they were prisoners, stripped of all rights, bound by steel and wire. In that moment, as they were marched into captivity, the women felt everything they had been taught about survival fall away. There was no enemy here to fight, no battle to be won, no honorable death to claim, only the cold, hard reality of survival. Their eyes scanned the faces of the soldiers as they were led to the camp. Confusion, fear, and disbelief flickered in their gazes. The women had been raised with the idea that to be captured by the enemy meant death, an end to their honor, an end to their lives. They had been told that they would be tortured, broken, used as pawns in a war they did not understand. Yet here they were, not tortured, not broken, but treated with a strange sense of care. The food, the warm barracks, the simple act of being allowed to exist, these were the things they had not expected. They had been prepared for cruelty, for humiliation. What they encountered instead felt like an impossible paradox. The starkness of it left them reeling. Surrender was supposed to mean the end. But here, in this strange place, it seemed to be the beginning of something else entirely, something neither the women nor their captors had expected. A new kind of survival, one that would force them to confront not just the enemy, but everything they had been taught to believe about themselves, about their duty, and about the world they had come from. As the days passed in the camp, the women began to settle into their new, unsettling reality. The barbed wire that separated them from the outside world had a strange effect. It was as if the wire, once a symbol of captivity, was now a reminder of how far they had come, how far they had fallen. They were not dead, not broken, not crushed by the weight of war as they had feared. Instead, they were alive, even though everything about their new life seemed to conflict with the image of their fate they had been taught to expect. And in those first moments of waking, something else became clear. These men who held the power of life and death over them were not what they had been led to believe. One morning, after the long, uncomfortable night of trying to sleep on the bare cot, one of the American guards approached them with a large jug of water. His uniform was dusty, but he was not a monster. He did not sneer or bark orders. He simply held out the jug, and his eyes met theirs in a way that was surprisingly gentle. Without a word, he poured the water into the cups they were given, and the women drank deeply. It wasn't much, but it was enough to sustain them in that moment. The cold water slipped down their parched throats, and for the first time in a long while, they felt something that was not hunger or fear. It was relief. That simple, unspoken act felt like a message, an invitation of sorts that there was no cruelty in this camp. It wasn't paradise, but it was something the women had never imagined they could find in captivity. Humanity. The next morning, a medic approached them with a tray of food, something warm, something they hadn't tasted in weeks. Stew, chunks of bread, and even a small piece of meat. It was nothing extravagant, but to the women, it felt like a feast. They took the food cautiously, as if waiting for the sting of betrayal. But there was no trap, no poisoned food, no ulterior motive. They ate slowly, feeling the heat of the food in their hands, and as they chewed, something stirred inside them. The food didn't just fill their bellies, it began to fill the spaces they didn't even know were empty. It was an act of kindness, a kindness they had been told would never come from the enemy. For the first time, they questioned everything they had been taught. The confusion grew as the days went on. The American soldiers seemed more like caretakers than captors. They tended to the women's wounds, cleaned their clothes, offered blankets when the night grew cold. They spoke in broken Japanese, trying to make conversation, trying to make the women feel at ease. One day, a soldier smiled at a woman who had been particularly silent and handed her a small tin cup filled with hot tea. His eyes were warm, but his expression was tinged with the same confusion that filled the women's hearts. He didn't look like a monster. He didn't look like someone who would harm them. He looked like a man who had seen too much of war, just as they had. And that small, simple gesture, the offering of tea, changed something within them. They began to see their captors not as faceless enemies, but as men with their own burdens, their own stories. Could it be possible? Could these men, these Americans, be as human as they were? The contradiction was maddening. How could they reconcile the image of the American soldier as a brutal, savage enemy with the reality of him standing in front of them, offering a cup of tea, offering medical care, offering the simplest thing, humanity? And yet, as they sat together, in the quiet of the camp, those small acts began to change everything. They were no longer the faceless enemy to be feared. They were men strange, flawed, and human, just like the women who had been caught in the tide of war. In the stillness of their barracks, the POWs began to speak in low whispers. The questions that had been buried deep in their minds began to rise, bubbling to the surface. The warmth of the camp, the unexpected kindness from their captors, it all seemed impossible. Their memories of the war and their upbringing felt distant, like another lifetime. They had been told, for as long as they could remember, that the Americans were merciless, ruthless, and cruel. Propaganda had painted them as monsters, incapable of compassion, driven only by a lust for destruction. Their country had told them that surrender would mean torture, dishonor, and death. Now, faced with a reality where none of that had come to pass, the women began to grapple with the most uncomfortable truth of all they had been lied to. The lies had been woven into their lives from an early age. They had grown up with the image of the American soldier as a savage, barbaric figure, one who would stop at nothing to destroy everything in their path. They had been taught to fear the Americans, to see them as less than human, to believe that their entire purpose was to bring about the destruction of Japan and its people. The radio broadcasts, the posters, the speeches, it all fed the same narrative. The enemy was cruel. The enemy was heartless. The enemy would show no mercy. There had been no room for doubt, no space for questioning the stories that were being fed to them. These were the truths they had been raised with, and to question them would be to question everything. But now, in the quiet moments after meals, when they found themselves in the dim light of their barracks, those truths began to fracture. The soldiers who had captured them had offered food, water, and even medicine. The men who had taken their freedom had not treated them with disdain. They had not abused them. Instead, they had shown them a kind of care that was foreign and unsettling. Every meal, every moment of tenderness, chipped away at the foundation of the lies they had built their lives upon. These men, who had been painted as monsters, were now just men doing a job, following orders, but also showing compassion in ways that none of them had ever expected. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but one that could not be ignored. The weight of this realization was crushing. For the first time, the women were forced to confront the lie they had been told. It wasn't just about the Americans. It was about everything they had been taught to believe, about honor, loyalty, and survival. To admit that they had been misled, to admit that they had been raised on a foundation of fear and hatred. They had trusted their leaders, trusted the stories they had been told. To realize that those stories were false was to feel as if the ground beneath them had crumbled away, leaving nothing but uncertainty. This internal struggle weighed heavily on them. Some of the women felt the sting of betrayal not just from their captors, but from their own country. They had been taught that the enemy was evil, that they would never show mercy, that they would never treat them with dignity. And yet, here they were, being treated with kindness, with respect, and with humanity. The truth of it cut deeper than any wound they had suffered on the battlefield. Some of the women refused to acknowledge it, burying their doubts beneath layers of pride and duty. They clung to the belief that this was a trick, a performance designed to break them down, to make them forget who they were. Others, though, couldn't ignore the reality in front of them. They could no longer deny the humanity of their captors. As they lay awake in the quiet of the camp, the women were faced with a truth that would forever change them. They had been deceived. The world they had known, the world they had been taught to believe in, was not the world they were now living in. And though the pain of this realization was sharp and disorienting, it was also the first step toward something new, something uncertain, but undeniably human. As the days passed in the camp, the women began to settle into their new, unsettling reality. The barbed wire that separated them from the outside world had a strange effect. It was as if the wire, once a symbol of captivity, was now a reminder of how far they had come, how far they had fallen. They were not dead, not broken, not crushed by the weight of war as they had feared. Instead, they were alive, even though everything about their new life seemed to conflict with the image of their fate they had been taught to expect. And in those first moments of waking, something else became clear. These men who held the power of life and death over them were not what they had been led to believe. One morning, after the long, uncomfortable night of trying to sleep on the bare cot, one of the American guards approached them with a large jug of water. His uniform was dusty, but he was not a monster. He did not sneer or bark orders. He simply held out the jug, and his eyes met theirs in a way that was surprisingly gentle. Without a word, he poured the water into the cups they were given, and the women drank deeply. It wasn't much, but it was enough to sustain them in that moment. The cold water slipped down their parched throats, and for the first time in a long while, they felt something that was not hunger or fear. It was relief. That simple, unspoken act felt like a message, an invitation of sorts that there was no cruelty in this camp. It wasn't paradise, but it was something the women had never imagined they could find in captivity. Humanity. The next morning, a medic approached them with a tray of food, something warm, something they hadn't tasted in weeks. Stew, chunks of bread, and even a small piece of meat. It was nothing extravagant, but to the women, it felt like a feast. They took the food cautiously, as if waiting for the sting of betrayal. But there was no trap, no poisoned food, no ulterior motive. They ate slowly, feeling the heat of the food in their hands, and as they chewed, something stirred inside them. The food didn't just fill their bellies, it began to fill the spaces they didn't even know were empty. It was an act of kindness, a kindness they had been told would never come from the enemy. For the first time, they questioned everything they had been taught. The confusion grew as the days went on. The American soldiers seemed more like caretakers than captors. They tended to the women's wounds, cleaned their clothes, offered blankets when the night grew cold. They spoke in broken Japanese, trying to make conversation, trying to make the women feel at ease. One day, a soldier smiled at a woman who had been particularly silent and handed her a small tin cup filled with hot tea. His eyes were warm, but his expression was tinged with the same confusion that filled the women's hearts. He didn't look like a monster. He didn't look like someone who would harm them. He looked like a man who had seen too much of war, just as they had. And that small, simple gesture, the offering of tea, changed something within them. They began to see their captors not as faceless enemies, but as men with their own burdens, their own stories. Could it be possible? Could these men, these Americans, be as human as they were? The contradiction was maddening. How could they reconcile the image of the American soldier as a brutal, savage enemy with the reality of him standing in front of them, offering a cup of tea, offering medical care, offering the simplest thing, humanity? And yet, as they sat together, in the quiet of the camp, those small acts began to change everything. They were no longer the faceless enemy to be feared. They were men strange, flawed, and human, just like the women who had been caught in the tide of war. In the quiet moments between their routines, one of the women, Yumi, found herself sitting by the small window of their barrack, staring out at the wide, open sky. The air, though still thick with the weight of captivity, felt different now, almost free, though the wire remained. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small scrap of paper and a pen. The weight of the ink against the paper felt heavy, like the pressure of her own heart. For days, she had wrestled with her feelings, the confusion, the disillusionment, and the overwhelming kindness she had received from the soldiers who had once been painted as her sworn enemies. She hesitated for only a moment before she began to write. The words flowed quickly at first, as if her hand were trying to catch up to the rush of emotion in her chest. She wrote about the food, the warmth, the small acts of kindness, the hands that helped her when she stumbled, the voices that tried to reassure her when she couldn't understand. She wrote about the men who had fed her, clothed her, and given her the one thing she had thought impossible in captivity, a semblance of dignity. But as she wrote, a cold, hard truth began to settle in. The more she described, the more the weight of her words grew. These men, these Americans, were they really so different from the men who had fought alongside her? Had they not shown mercy, kindness, and respect? She couldn't bring herself to cross out the words, even though they began to feel like a confession, like an admission of betrayal. It was cathartic, this act of writing, and yet it was also deeply painful. The letter was not just a recounting of her time in the camp, it was a recognition of the truth she had tried to suppress. The enemy she had been taught to hate, the enemy she had been raised to fight without mercy, was not the savage creature she had imagined. She folded the letter carefully, placing it in the envelope, her hands trembling slightly. It wasn't just a letter to her family. It was an act of self-reckoning. She was giving voice to the truth she had been hiding from both the kindness she had received and the guilt of acknowledging it. Yumi's family, back in Japan, had already received the letter, and with it came accusations. Her words of gratitude, of the kindness she had been shown, now felt like a public confession of weakness, of compromise. The propaganda she had lived by all her life had painted the Americans as ruthless, merciless beasts. To speak of their kindness now was to defy everything she had been raised to believe. The letter's contents, so full of her own truth, had been distorted into something dishonorable. To the Japanese government, to the leaders who still held power, it was evidence of betrayal, evidence that they had failed in their indoctrination, that they had lost control of their people even in the face of captivity. Yumi was told she had to silence her truth, to deny her own experiences, or risk losing everything, her family's pride, her honor, her very identity. In the quiet of the barracks, Yumi sat alone with the letter she had written. The ink on the page was fading, but the truth still burned in her chest. She had come to the camp expecting torture, degradation, and death, but instead she had been met with an unexpected kindness. Now she was faced with an impossible choice between two loyalties, two worlds, and a truth that threatened to unravel everything she had been taught. The moment of truth had arrived, and the weight of it threatened to break her. It was later that evening, as the women gathered around the campfire, that something within them began to shift. They had long sat in silence, staring into the fire, their thoughts swirling in a fog of confusion and fear. The flickering orange light seemed to soften the harshness of their new reality, casting shadows that danced like ghosts. The crackling fire was a constant presence, a steady reminder of their captivity. But tonight, it would hold a different kind of magic. A cowboy, his face weathered and worn, but his eyes full of something softer, sat on a log nearby. He pulled out a banjo, its wooden frame creaking slightly under his fingers. As the strings hummed, a soft, simple melody filled the night air. It was a song that none of them recognized, but it was the sound of something they had long forgotten: life. At first, the women sat still, unsure of how to respond. The music was so foreign, yet so familiar. It seemed to capture something deep inside them, something buried beneath the layers of war, survival, and fear. The cowboy strummed the banjo gently, his hands moving with the ease of someone who had played this song 1,000 times. As the tune floated through the air, the women looked at one another, their eyes softening for the first time in months. The noise of war and the screams of battle seemed distant in that moment, replaced by the simple, unpretentious sound of a song. Slowly, almost hesitantly, one of the women smiled. It was a small, uncertain movement, but it was a smile nonetheless. Then another and another, until the group of women began to smile in unison. It wasn't just a smile. It was the first real laugh they had shared since before the war began. The laughter bubbled up, a sound filled with the tension of survival, the sorrow of loss, and yet a glimmer of something new, a glimpse of hope. It was hesitant at first, almost embarrassed, as though the very act of laughing felt foreign to them. But it was laughter, true, deep, healing laughter that filled the space between them. For the first time in months, the women felt like themselves again. They weren't just victims of war, trapped in a strange land. They were women, capable of joy, capable of connection. The music had unlocked something inside them, a part of their humanity they had buried beneath the weight of their experiences. It was as if the cowboy, with his simple song, had given them permission to remember what it was like to feel alive, to feel human again. The laughter became a release, a catharsis, as they let go of the fear, the anger, and the grief that had held them captive for so long. The moment felt fragile, as if the laughter might shatter the illusion they had built to protect themselves. But instead, it solidified something within them, a quiet defiance against the pain they had endured. They weren't going to forget the horrors of war, but they were also going to remember the moments of joy that had slipped away. The song played on, a gentle rhythm that seemed to ease the ache in their hearts. The fire crackled, and the shadows of the night seemed to soften, as though even the world around them was taking a deep breath. If you're enjoying this story, please give the video a like and leave a comment below, letting us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts and reactions. But as the days passed and the warmth of the fire receded, the reality of captivity crept back in. The laughter began to fade, replaced by the quiet hum of daily life in the camp. The women went about their tasks, the routines of survival, working, eating, sleeping, but something had shifted inside them. They no longer saw the American soldiers as faceless enemies. They no longer flinched at the sight of them, nor did they shrink from their gaze. The cold walls of fear, which had once kept them locked in a world of animosity and suspicion, had started to crumble. They began to see the soldiers not as monsters, but as flawed, human beings, men who were doing a job. Yes, but also men who had been caught in the same web of war and violence. In those quiet moments between work and rest, the women reflected on the transformation. They had been taught to hate, to fear, to resist. They had been taught that surrender was a betrayal, and that the enemy would never show them compassion. Yet here they were, being cared for by the very men who had once been the embodiment of their worst fears. There were no taunts, no sneers. The men did not strip them of their dignity. They did not mock them for their defeat. Instead, the soldiers were beginning to treat them like people, just people, not enemies, not prisoners, but human beings. It was a slow, almost imperceptible change, but it was happening. The women saw it in the way the soldiers moved, how they no longer stood with their weapons drawn, how they greeted the women with polite nods, how they shared small smiles. The barriers between them were beginning to blur. The emotional toll of this transformation was not lost on anyone. It was easier to remain locked in the comfort of hate and fear, to see the world as a series of sides, us versus them. But as the weeks passed, both the women and the soldiers were forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that the war had never been just about sides. It had been about human beings flawed, complicated, and, at times, deeply misunderstood. The line between captor and captive, between enemy and ally, began to blur, and with it came the realization that perhaps the war had not been about destroying each other. Perhaps it had been about something more complex, the need to find humanity in a world that seemed to have lost it. The quiet reconciliation between the women and their captors didn't come in grand gestures. It wasn't marked by speeches or proclamations. It came in the small, everyday interactions, the moments when the soldiers treated the women with respect, when the women began to speak to the soldiers without fear, when the laughter around the campfire became more genuine, more free. The emotional distance that had once defined their relationship was beginning to close, not through force or violence, but through simple acts of kindness and understanding. Neither the women nor the soldiers could erase the past, but in that shared space, they were beginning to create something new, something that transcended the horrors of war. In the end, both the women and the men were changed. They were no longer just enemies or prisoners. They were human beings, bound together by the strange, complicated realities of survival. The time had come for the women to leave the camp. The trucks that would take them back to their homeland were waiting, their engines humming quietly in the early morning light. But as they stood in line, each woman felt a strange, undeniable weight in her chest. The world they were about to re-enter was one they had not known for a long time, the world they had been taught to believe in. The world that had existed before captivity. It was a world of duty, of loyalty, of fierce pride in their country. It was the world they had left behind when they boarded the trains that had taken them to America, full of fear and hatred. They had been soldiers, loyal to their emperor, loyal to their nation. But now, after months of captivity, months of survival in a place that had shattered everything they thought they knew, they were different. They had been changed, not by the enemy's cruelty, but by their kindness. As the women climbed into the trucks that would carry them back to Japan, their hearts were heavy with the weight of this change. They were no longer the same women who had arrived on the American ranch. The fear, the hatred, the mistrust, they had been replaced by something more complicated, more painful. They had seen their captors as monsters, as less than human. And yet, in the days that followed, they had learned that the enemy they had been taught to fear and despise was not so different from them after all. They had received kindness, respect, and humanity from the very men they had been taught to hate. The war they had fought in, the world they had known, no longer made sense. How could they reconcile the image of the American soldier as a monster with the reality of the man who had offered them food, medical care, and a kind word when they had been at their lowest? How could they return to a world that demanded they hate the enemy when the enemy had shown them dignity? The difficulty of returning home after everything they had experienced was immense. The women knew they would face suspicion, even scorn, from their families and countrymen. They had been taught to endure, to resist, to fight, to return to Japan and admit that they had been wrong, that the enemy was not what they had been told, would be to risk everything. They had been loyal to their emperor, loyal to their nation, and yet now they were forced to question everything they had been taught. The world they were returning to no longer seemed familiar. It felt like a place full of contradictions, a place where the ideals they had fought for now seemed impossible to uphold. How could they reconcile the world they had left behind with the one they had found in America? How could they return to their homes, their families, and pretend that they had not been changed by the kindness they had received from the men who had once been their enemies? The emotional toll of this return was overwhelming. The women were returning as survivors, not as victims. They had endured the worst, and yet they had found something in the midst of captivity that had changed them. They had found humanity, not just in themselves, but in their captors. They had learned to see the enemy not as a monster, but as a person. It was a lesson that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. But it was also a lesson that made returning to their old lives, their old identities, nearly impossible. They could not go back to the way things had been before the war, before captivity. They could not simply forget what they had learned. The world they were returning to no longer made sense. They were returning to a place of duty and loyalty, but also a place of misunderstanding and mistrust. The kindness they had received from the soldiers, the warmth they had felt in the camp, would stay with them forever. It was a kindness they had never expected, a kindness they could never repay. But it was also a kindness that had given them something priceless: dignity. The women were not just survivors. They were women who had been treated with respect, with humanity. They had been shown kindness in the darkest of times, and that kindness had allowed them to reclaim something they had almost lost, something that could never be taken away: their dignity. If you found this story as moving as we have, please give the video a like and leave a comment below, letting us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts and reactions to this powerful piece of history. Thank you for remembering these untold stories with us.